morning, and welcome to part 3 of 3, the third part in the webinar series, Challenging Ideology, looking at historical museum practices through an Indigenous lens. Today's event is presented by the Residential School History and Dialogue Centre at UBC in partnership with the UBC Learning Circle and the Centre for Excellence Indigenous Health. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge with respect and gratitude that we're all joining you today, or I'm joining you today from the UBC Vancouver Point Grey campus, which is situated on the traditional, ancestral and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam peoples. Holding this event virtually allows us to engage with people from many different regions, and I encourage you to acknowledge the territory you are calling from and introduce yourself in the chat feature. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank our supporters, the First Nations Health Authority, which generously supports Learning Circle events, and the Museum Association, excuse me, the BC Museums Association, which provided funding for this webinar series. Today's webinar will explore what it means to decolonize museums from an academic and a museum perspective. We'll also be answering some questions that came in from the guests at the previous 2 events in the series. And if time permits, we'll also answer questions that come up today. So feel free to post your questions in the chat. And just for context, the 2 previous events are also available online, which we can share in the chat to view previously, which is where the questions were generated from. Today, we are honored to be joined by Melissa Adams, who is the librarian and archivist for the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, Jordan Wilson, an emerging curator and writer and PhD student in anthropology at New York University, Genevieve Hill, manager of the BC Archaeological Collections at the Royal BC Museum, and Genevieve Weber, head of archives for the Royal BC Museum. I'll now ask our panelists to introduce themselves more fully in just a few minutes. My name is, just a few moments. My name is Elizabeth Schaefer. I'm the Executive Director of the Residential School History and Dialogue Centre. I'll be moderating today's discussion. We also have a few staff in the background I'd like to introduce and acknowledge. From the Learning Circle, we have Cynthia Lung, production coordinator, and Serene Gawkin, the Learning Circle's new manager, supporting behind the scenes. Shannon Robinson from the Residential School History and Dialogue Centers is the education programming strategist here and is managing the chat function for us today. Thank you, Shannon. And Kristen Kozar, who's the digital collections specialist at the center, is the curator for this webinar series. She's a member of the Halitsim First Nation and co-leading the oral testimony project at the center here, where she focuses on research and engagement. So thank you, Kristen, for really doing this amazing work and bringing us all together into these important conversations. Also, just a reminder that some of the topics covered today may be sensitive and can be emotionally triggering or challenging for some folks. So please make sure you're looking after yourself. And if at any point you feel that you need to talk to a friend, an elder, a counselor, or a family member, please don't hesitate to do so. We'll also be sharing some resources that might be of some support or help in the chat function throughout the conversation today. So now I'd like to turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves.
Amasa, Melissa Adams Schwa, Wilps was in we bill quitqui, sim gasgasni, get like damics will de wheatqui, damics will joy. Good day, everyone. My name's Melissa Adams. I'm a member of the Niska Nation from the House of Wisniewilk of the Giscast or Killer Whale tribe. I'm the librarian and archivist at the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and joining you from the territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I have various background in libraries, archives, and museums, and graduated from UBC with a Master's of Archival Studies. I'm happy to be with you all today.
I'm going to nudge Jordan to go next, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jordan. I am currently a PhD student at New York University in anthropology. I'm a member of the Musqueam First Nation. Much of my professional academic experience is rooted at UBC. However, I've worked at the Museum of Anthropology in a number of contexts, working on exhibitions. I have a master's in anthropology from UBC and a Bachelor of Arts from the First Nations and Indigenous Studies program. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Hi, my name is Genevieve Hill. I'm acting curator of archaeology at the Royal BC Museum, usually collection manager. I'm speaking to you today from the Lekwungen territory, the home of Songhees and Esquimalt nations. And I myself, I'm of British ancestry and was raised in Cowichan territory. I have a master's and PhD from the University of Exeter in wetland archaeology, and I'm really pleased to be with you today.
Hi everyone, I'm Genevieve Weber. I'm the acting head of archives at the BC Archives, which is part of the Royal BC Museum, and which is situated on the Lekwungen territory, and I also live on the Lekwungen territory. I grew up here as a white settler, and I'm really happy to be speaking to you from here today. I have a Master of Archival Studies degree from UBC, and I participated in the First Nations concentration program there, and have worked in community and with communities for my entire career, with Indigenous communities for my entire career. In my base position, I am the first point of contact for Indigenous communities coming in to do research at the archives, and most recently have been focusing on processing and making accessible residential school records.
Thank you all so much. And again, thank you for being in this space again with us for the third webinar. So I think with that, I thank you and welcome to all. We'll jump into the discussion with some questions. And as I mentioned, these questions are coming from, some are compiled from the ones that have been the previous two webinars. So we'll start with the first one. In your work for decolonizing or indigenizing your practices, how do you ensure that the labor that can be cultural, emotional, spiritual, or otherwise of the Indigenous peoples who do not usually work on the team are recognized in the work they provide? And I'm not sure if anyone in particular would like to start answering that. Maybe one of the Genevieves from RPCM perhaps could jump in.
I can jump in. In reading the questions for today, there's most of the questions, I felt there was many angles to approach them, but I think one of the very simple answers to that question is always provide financial compensation for work that Indigenous people do. That has certainly not always been done. There's definitely been an assumption that Indigenous people should give their time and efforts to doing this kind of work. And obviously that's completely inappropriate. We wouldn't ask that of most other people. So financial compensation is a big one. The other thing that I have found is really important is to make the time and space for the work to be done in the way that is most appropriate and following the protocols of the people doing that work for you, in whatever way that means. So if that means that there needs to be extra time added onto the project to include protocols from their community regarding handling material or including a ceremonial aspect, particularly when it's material that is very sensitive. That's really important to ensure that that you have a discussion about what is expected up front and make space and time for those aspects of the work that may not be done in your regular course of business.
Yeah, I'm just going to follow on with that. Genevieve hit all of the main points. I think getting down to the details, it also involves changing the way that the internal systems behind the scenes work and getting all staff on board for that. Everything from, making sure that people are paid in a timely fashion, people's costs are covered up front, and that we're not putting people out of pocket to get the work initiated or going, making sure that the systems behind the scenes and the timelines of the museum or the institution are more flexible, and that we're not forcing our timelines on community members, especially when their work is something that we've asked them to do. And I think focusing on creating those long-term relationships so that these shorter-term contracts have more support throughout the institution, throughout the communities.
I totally agree with what has been said so far, and yeah, related to that, I think one of the things we have to work on overcoming in academia, or I can speak more about library and archives professions, but the idea that the service work is part of just what you do, that as part of your job, and where my train of thought just derailed. Yeah, so that expectation that service work is just what you do, recognizing even with that there's issues, because often that service work falls on more early career people and women and that kind of thing. So definitely compensation, make it as do it ahead of time rather than expecting people to claim back costs. That's really important. I think another aspect of that as well is when we're thinking about emotional labor, because some of the things that I've encountered, for example, is white people are learning about residential school, is that suddenly you kind of feel you're in a situation where you're trying to comfort them about their shock of just learning what just happened. So I guess for that, in short, don't expect that kind of labor from people. And even if you do have a relationship with some and want to talk about, check in with them first and see if they have the capacity to be able to deal with it at that time. Yeah, those are my initial thoughts on it. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. It'd be pretty wild if I was like, I completely disagree, but I think, you know what, I think for me, it kind of like goes back to the intentions of a project or the project design, in terms of how can it be made reciprocal to the community or the community members that you're working with. I think, you know, that often there can be an assumption that the project that's developed within an institution, for example, you know, with the best of intentions in mind, could also in a way end up being extractive because it's really meeting the institutional goals rather than community goals. And so, yeah, I think like you know, like questioning the assumption that, you know, that the project that you have designed or that the institution has designed is automatically of benefit and of interest of participants, maybe. That's something that I try to keep in mind, because I think, yeah, it's, you know, I think a lot of, you know, people within our communities are, you know, often very generous and very selfless and will say yes and agree to participate and work on a project. But yeah, I think like it's a matter of collaborating from the outset so that it's mutually beneficial. The other thing that came to mind is, you know, in response to this question, is the idea of like ongoing consent as well, which I think, yeah, connects into what I was just saying in terms of like, you know, ensuring that people are still satisfied and happy with their engagement with the project and their involvement, how they're represented, or how their perspectives or how their knowledge is being shared or disseminated. So I think that's also something to keep in mind. And you know, and again, with this question of consent is, you know, like the question of what happens to that labor after, like if someone's sharing their knowledge, you know, the questions of like who owns that material afterwards, who stewards that material afterwards, and how will that material be accessed or engaged in the future? Because again, there's the potential for that to be misused, and for that, and also for that, yeah, for that labor to be kind of, I don't want to use the word exploited, but, you know, can just again be the sort of like continuous source that benefits the institution more so than it benefits community. And then I think, you know, in simple terms, like it's also a matter of like adequately and properly crediting the contributors or the collaborators on a project so that their labor is publicly acknowledged, and that they are, yeah, properly credited for their contributions. And the last thing I was thinking was just in terms of like, yeah, the distribution of that labor. Often in these contexts, you know, it's like when we're based in an institution, we are the ones that are like working on something full time, you know, often have salaried positions, and sometimes in my experience, it's like I'm like a contract, you know, on contract to work on a project, which is you know, requires careful time management, for example, so that you know that you're not being overstretched. Whereas I think people who are within institutions, you know, have the comfort of that being part of their full-time salaried position, for example. And so I think that, yeah, you know, like just being, yeah, mindful of the asks and figuring out ways that you can commit your own resources or institutional resources to help take on some of that work without the automatic expectation that a participant or contributor or collaborator has the time to do that.
Yeah, just adding to what Jordan said, I can totally agree with what he said as well, but especially with that last part, that's something that I think I and other Indigenous people have encountered in institutions, is that you're hired to do for one job, but then because you're Indigenous, you're, especially if you're one of the only or one of the few, suddenly you're the Indigenous quote unquote expert, or the person that people come to with questions, even if they're not something that you should be answering. So that's, yeah, not adding to that labor. Or I recognize that it's unrealistic to expect that never to happen, building that time in ahead of time.
Thank you so much. I think there's a lot of consensus here on, you know, so much work still has to happen, but also as that work happens to build better infrastructures, there really needs to be an awareness amongst the people working in them about better practices and protocols that are happening now. And I wonder, this reminds me of part of the conversation we've had the last two webinars, and I think it came up, grants came up, and other things, like looking at that high level of starting to implement, right, those ideas. So is it that institutional pieces, it seems, and I wonder if any of that, I know RBCM is doing some work there, if the Genevieves can speak to the fact that this is really, you know, that institutional advocacy has to happen at that level for these shifts to happen as well, if that makes sense. Does that seem clear? And I see that Kim's come in and really is talking about that inequity of labor, right? And equitable labor, even if it's acknowledged, but I think it's, again, going beyond the acknowledgement and really that advantage, that cultural loading is often what our colleagues here call it as well. So I think really an example of that is being so present here in the moment, and really thinking about the compensatory frameworks that institutions have. And I think, Jordan, you made that point that, you know, if it's someone's job already, the infrastructure is there, is how I'm hearing that, to support them when those extra things come along. But those extra things that, you know, if people want to do this work well, they're cultural loading onto those people they're bringing in ways that are not being acknowledged or compensated or recognized, is how I'm reading that. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to jump into our next moment here, and our next question here. So what is your experience, and I think this segues nicely, with policy and or protocol change or creation in addressing these imbalances within the GLAM sector, so galleries, libraries, archives, museums, and Indigenous communities or Indigenous cultural institutions? So essentially, what's your experience here with that? And again, I'll let, don't know if anyone wants to particularly start on that one.
I'll jump in here. So with regard to policy, I mean, I think Policy and protocol change is part of the question. I think change assumes that there's always policy there to begin with. And I think that's a big thing that we had to focus on here is there isn't always policy because some of these things are new. You know, the repatriation of ancestral remains, while it's not a new thing, was done on a case-by-case basis. And there wasn't a robust formal policy in our case. And so a few years ago, we actually had to, you know, really look at what it means and really sort of start to create something that was formalized, but also retained the flexibilities that we could be doing work that is in line with what the communities wish and is flexible enough to meet that. So yeah, for us, it was about sort of almost starting from scratch. And I also think as just a caveat to all institutions that even when you do come up with some good positive change in your policy and protocol, that nobody should be resting on their laurels and just thinking like, good job, we've got a really great new shiny policy for this. We really have to keep looking at all of the policies on a repeated basis, reviewing them, seeing if they meet goals, and constantly tweaking and updating them. And we can't just do it once and leave it at that. I think it really needs community feedback. There need to be robust systems of obtaining that feedback so that things are constantly improved, and not just improved from a colonial white museum standpoint, but from like meeting community goals.
I'll follow up from that. I agree with everything Genevieve said. That's going to be the standard quote of the day, I think. But in addition, I spoke at the last webinar about the constraints of being in a government institution and how complicated that can be because as a Crown corporation, we are tied to government policies that we don't often have the ability to change easily because they're actually created in completely different ministries and then imposed upon us. As a result, I think as a result of that, I have become really focused on procedures as well. So in addition to having robust policies and reviewing them regularly with community input, as Genevieve mentioned, in the archives in particular, a lot of the policies and the legislation that we are bound to work within have been imposed upon us. So what the sort of, I guess it's sort of a workaround, but the practical way of addressing that is when we realize that we do have policies in place that broadly cover what we're looking to do. It's a matter of getting down to the specific procedures and how we actually implement that. And that's where I find internally we have so much flexibility because those are our own internal procedures. So for example, in the archives, we've been working on looking at changing the way that we do descriptive work in the archives. And for those of you working in the archival field, I'm sure you're well aware that the rules for archival description that most archives use here in Canada have a lot of flaws and are lacking many fields that would allow us to properly describe Indigenous records. So as we started to write an internal policy around language, we realized that actually the policy part of it, the ideas that we want to be respectful and center Indigenous understandings of information and place names, and that work was already captured in other policies. What we needed was a very finely detailed procedure on how to actually apply the bigger ideas that we had. So I think it really has to be a combination of both. Once you have a good policy, the staff need to be able to actually implement that and to know exactly how to do that. So, and I think both need to be reviewed constantly. Procedures also need to be updated regularly so that we don't end up falling into habits that just lead to us employing the same bad practices that we have in the past.
I can jump in and add to that and also agree with what the Genevieves have said. One thing I would definitely caution, because I've seen this happen recognizing that there are can be big institutions, even small institutions, but there are certain templates that they have to follow. I would be what I've sometimes seen is that the institution creates the policy because they have this template that they have to follow, and then they bring it to Indigenous people. I don't know how that might kind of stifle the conversation that might happen if you weren't starting from trying to fit into this template. Also, personally, as I was reflecting on the questions for today, and this will relate, I believe we're having a question later more about related to power, but I sometimes wonder, just based on my early experience in the field, where I definitely felt kind of precarious, that as a result now I'm not thinking big enough. Like I'm used to, because that's what I learned, used to kind of fitting into the existing ways of doing things and challenging that and thinking really big how things can be different is something that I guess I'm challenging myself to do, just because when I first joined the profession, I kind of felt like there was a right way to do things, and that's not. So having that bigger thinking and having that input right from the start regarding policy and procedure development is so important, and not just, I mean, you've been talking about this already, but not just that input from within the institution, even from with the Indigenous staff within the institution, but really doing that outreach. Thanks.
Did you have anything to add to that one, Jordan, before I want to give you a moment to?
I don't have too much to add. I think, a lot of my experience has been working on a project specific basis. And I think that's part of the, perhaps part of the structural issue that needs to be addressed, is that's typically the model that institutions follow, or has been, wherein Indigenous people often have, are in contract positions or guest curator positions. And so, I mean, which has been, incredibly valuable for me. And I don't mean to say that that's a bad thing, because I've learned so much in working that way, but I think it's, I also wonder if that is the sort of implicit model that doesn't really challenge the status quo in terms of policy or long-term programming decisions, or structural change. So I think, in my experience, I don't feel like I've really been in the position or had the power to kind of to address those issues. And then also I think, it connects back to that question of labor, being asked to do one thing, say that, it's project specific, or, a specific position, but then, I think Indigenous peoples often find themselves in these positions wherein they're expected to do more than what they've actually been hired to do, and, are expected to help fix these problems, or to do that, in ways, uncompensated or uncredited labor, in terms of trying to change the institution overall. And I think that, there's a tricky balance between those two things, because obviously as Indigenous peoples, we want to shift shift practices and policies, but that can only be accomplished if there's like the resources and willingness on behalf of the institution to actually address that.
Thank you.
Sorry, can I just?
How about, yeah, Melissa and Genevieve.
I wondered too if some of this policy changes something related to responses to UNDRIP and the TRC, is that a lot of us took this work on doing it off the side of our desks. So I think that's has an influence on just how and when we're able to make these changes, and also just it's not healthy for the people trying to do this work. So yeah, there need to be resources devoted to developing policies and procedures. They take time.
I just wanted to echo what Jordan and Melissa were saying, in that there need to be the resources and there needs to be institutional support, not just in that single position that is created, not just in that department, but across the whole institution. There needs to be support for the goals that we're trying to achieve, and yeah, I think institutions have to take the time to really do a sort of deep dive on themselves and really examine, like, are all of our systems, not just the systems pertaining to Indigenous cultural material, but are all the systems functioning in support of that? And I think we need to get there as well.
Thank you. I think that's such valid points being made here. And I wanted to bring in a couple of things. One, yeah, as I was writing notes on what you were saying, all of you, Melissa, you're bang on. I kind of hit Dripa, UNDRIP question mark. Like, I'm thinking, you know, some of these protocols and practices are coming into play, but it seems that our colleague Kim Lawson has joined us in the chat as well. And we stand on the shoulders of much of the work that folks like Kim have done. And I just wonder, something that she brought to our attention was that we have these workarounds still, right? And I think it's still getting to that, what you just said, Genevieve, and what you've all been speaking to, is we're still lacking that structural institutional change. So it has to, you know, it's you know, grassroots kind of coming from the bottom up has a certain currency and a certain authenticity to it, I suppose. But it seems that if you don't have the infrastructure support, the proper compensation, the respect, the permanent positions, the security that gives one to then go and act in this way, that we're still kind of stuck in this struggle, which I think maybe is a nice segue into our next question, which is about power in the sector. So how would you define power within the galleries, libraries, archives, and museum sector? And how would you understand power distribution within or across the sectors? And of course, you know, if you want to focus on the sector you're most familiar with, I'd appreciate that too. So is there anyone who'd like to jump into that one initially? Can I be cheeky and pick on someone first?
I can jump in with some initial
Thanks,
kind of brief thoughts. Yeah, I think power relates to just being able to make decisions and make change. And yeah, just being able to set those policies and procedures. And there's also that, I think one of the things we're dealing with, or a situation that's kind of happening in some cases now, is that they're like sort of early career people in the field may want to make changes, but definitely in the library and archives field, and I'm assuming museums as well, like so often our positions are contract or precariously employed in early career. So not only are you kind of not in a position hierarchically in power to make those changes, if you do want to challenge something or speak out about something, it's because of that power imbalance, it's harder to do, just because you may be worried about future employment. So relating to, like, even personally, I felt a lot more comfortable talking about these issues and about my earlier experiences in the field now that I have a permanent full-time job and I'm at an Indigenous institution that I know supports me. So yeah, there's all sorts of ways power comes into play.
Would anyone like to add to that?
I'll add a quick bit to say that I think in order to make real positive change on the institutional side, that all levels of staff, particularly those with the most power, need to really be reflecting on even the way that they ask for things. I think there's an awful lot of, you know, like, oh, we acknowledge there's a problem, we're going to change things, we're going to do things in a positive way. But even some of the asks that they make that might seem small are actually much bigger in light of the power imbalance. And so, yeah, I think there needs to be a real reflection from those with the most power on how that impacts those with less power. Big discussion, obviously.
Jordan, I think you unmuted there. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I agree with what Melissa said in terms of like who has the ability to make decisions. I think in the museum sector, and I guess across the GLAM sector, I think power also resides in ownership of materials, and you know, the yeah, like the ownership and stewardship of those materials. So you know, it means that the Indigenous peoples really don't have a choice in, you know, like if they want to access their heritage, that they are, you know, that museums are gatekeepers to that material, and they have, and that Indigenous peoples are forced to engage with those institutions and to navigate those institutions. So I think that is a incredible source of power for institutions in the GLAM sector. And I think that's kind of like the top level question that would, you know, needs to be addressed in terms of like, yeah, the questions of ownership and stewardship and how to distribute that power more evenly, or in a way that is deemed adequate or desirable to the Indigenous communities from which those materials originate.
If I could, oh, sorry, Genevieve, did you want to?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up on what Jordan was saying with a little example from the archaeology sector, which is that, as you say, sort of stewardship is where, you know, the reins of power are held. And so in the archaeology field, there are over 50 repositories across the province. And while everybody acknowledges that cultural material that's excavated from sites should stay as close to home as possible, it's still, you know, the province is still the gatekeeper of who gets to be a repository or not. And I think that there needs to be a lot of reflecting on what those rules are and how they came to be, and really changing those rules so that we can have communities be the guides on this and not the province.
Yeah, when I was reading this question, I was thinking about it very much from the perspective that Jordan was talking about, which I'll touch on in a minute. But then as the rest of you were talking about internal institutional power, I couldn't help but reflect on things that I've experienced that are really embedded in the hierarchy or the hierarchical structure of a lot of the institutions that we work in, particularly larger ones. And how I'm not ultimately against having a hierarchical structure in terms of management and the way that we kind of manage people. However, we talk a lot at our work about trusting and respecting the knowledge of the people doing the work, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but that particularly if it's non-Indigenous folks, those who are working really closely in communities and have done a lot of this, a lot of work to ensure that information and knowledge is in the hands and control of the Indigenous communities. when that trust and respect in the staff and the folks doing the work isn't there, what it leads to is the ability for the people that have the decision-making power to make decisions that are incredibly harmful long-term. So there's been so many cases that I've witnessed where the advice of the staff that have been pouring hours and energy into a project are completely ignored, and the decision that is made actually does serious damage to the relationships that were being built for years leading up to that decision being made. So institutionally, there has to be you have to have a really strong, trusting network of people working together in order for power to be balanced internally before you can even think about going out and doing good work. So that's sort of a one thought. But in terms of what Jordan was saying, that's exactly where I went immediately when I read this question was in archives, information and knowledge is power. And in so many cases, Indigenous communities aren't even aware of the information that is stored in archives about their community, about their family members, about themselves. And that information is such it's wealth, it's so important. So the fact that I've written about the fact that, for me as a staff person at an archives, I have constant regular access to incredible amounts of information that I don't even think I should have access to a lot of the time, let alone have control over. So I wrote about one example that is the Douglas Treaties, or sometimes called the Vancouver Island Treaties, which are a series of colonial era treaties and agreements between the Hudson's Bay Company and Indigenous communities on southern Vancouver Island and northern Vancouver Island. And these treaties, we have them at the archives, and they are incredibly valuable. And we have copies that we make publicly accessible, but the originals we don't make accessible unless the signatory communities ask to see them. I can go and see them anytime I want. I could walk in now and go and hold them and look through the originals. That is an unbelievable amount of power and control that I have. If a signatory community wants to see the originals, they have to go through an unbelievable series of hoops. And then when they do see them, we keep them locked in a glass case with a security camera shining directly on the space where they're being shown them, and a security guard standing right there staring at them the whole time. It's so indicative of the unbelievable power imbalance that is happening with, and that's just one record. There's millions of those just in the repository where I work alone. So this type of power imbalance, exactly as Jordan was saying, the stewardship aspect, ensuring that Indigenous communities have ownership and control and possession of their own information is really important. And I sometimes feel daunted and overwhelmed by how much work is ahead of us at the BC Archives to ensure that all that information is in the hands of Indigenous communities. But I think that's my life's work ahead of me, and hopefully everybody else that I work with as well.
Do any of our panelists want to add to that? We've had Kim Lawson share in the chat again. I'd like to make sure everyone bring it to your attention that quote Kim here, often just so these situations that you're discussing are often lean on financial accountability. So really such decisions in the structure really negate, right, the accountability of Indigenous individuals, families, and communities that the staff and the practices that you're talking about, Genevieve, are trying to be put in place. And it kind of comes back to that. I guess the sub question I would ask anyone, bringing in Dripa, bringing in UNDRIP, so when you talked earlier, Genevieve Weber, about, you're as a government institution, you're reliant on these, but now the government is mandated to, hustle and shift and change and be more accountable, to be more consultative and to resource these things appropriately. Do you think, does anyone want to weigh in? Do you think that can be an instrument in addressing power imbalance at the levels we're talking about. From what I'm hearing from you, it's really lacking. And, you know, Jordan's comment about stewardship and ownership, and you know, Melissa's, you know, saying like people work from precarious through to somewhere, but then there's still so much labor unaccounted for, but they're still pushing up against those structures that are not supportive or inviting. Does anyone want to comment more about instruments like that to aid? Genevieve Hill?
Oh, would love to. Yeah, so, you know, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the investigation that the museum went through. And I think there's been a lot of reflecting on the policies internally. But one of the things that I've heard over and over again is, you know, that there's sort of like putting the focus and attention onto other government agencies as if they are beyond reproach, and that there's no possibility that any other agencies have also got racist policies or anything like that. And specifically with regard to funding and finance, there seems to be like, yeah, money is the bottom line, and that the assumption that a decision that's based on finances couldn't be racist and it couldn't be discriminatory to Indigenous communities. The budget is the budget, and you know, they forget that somebody is making this decision about what that budget looks like. And if there isn't, somebody isn't budgeting for meaningful change, you know, to achieve our goals under Dripa, then that's a decision that someone made, and it too is able to be racist and discriminatory. So, yeah, you know, as Kim said, financially accountable is often the go-to excuse, but I think we all have to start interrogating that excuse too, because money is not neutral. It never has been neutral. And, you know, it's tied back to our discussion about who has the power. And yeah, I mean, another big discussion, but I'll leave it there for now.
I was going to step in earlier to talk about Dripa as well, but I figured it would come up again when we were talking about the policy part of things. I am both relieved and frustrated that, yes, Elizabeth, exactly as you hinted, having Dripa is incredibly helpful. It's so, when we had the TRC calls to action, I mean, even going back to previous decades ago, when there were other reports that came out around working around Indigenous cultural heritage and how the country should be addressing the imbalances of power. There's been reports for decades. Having a report is great. Being able to say the TRC calls to action, say we have to do this, but it's not. Some people listen. But honestly, it wasn't until now I can say there's legislation. We are legally bound to do this. And it's frustrating that we have to work within the same colonial government structure in order to actually get anything done. So it wasn't until something that fit within the confines of that structure came along that I feel like there's weight behind it. But it does help. And I think I mentioned in the last panel that the legislation, the Dripa or the BC legislation to implement UNDRIP is often very much at odds with other legislation, but at least it's something that is considered legally binding. And as Genevieve can attest, we are very much still in the early stages at Royal BC Museum of finding ways to ensure that it is implemented. I think there was an idea at the beginning that we would wait for direction from government, and that isn't happening. So we have to ensure that we can implement it internally in our own way. And that's something that we're working towards. And it is, I just can't say enough how it's both frustrating that it is that we had to wait for legislation to back us up, but it is also a relief that it's there. I think it will help us going forward.
I think, yeah, some thoughts related to this aspect of the discussion. There are people within our organizations and professions that don't want to change and think what the way things are now is fine, and having that legislation or having things in policy and procedure are a means of kind of, I guess, maybe securing, or I don't want to use the word forcing, but sort of forcing change, especially when there are people who are going to, or organizations that are going to resist that. So even though policies and legislation in a way are such a like Western colonialists, especially when you're having to follow these templates and stuff, means of addressing it, it can be a way to, I think it's important that they're there so that you, when somebody is resisting something, you can say, well, this is what our policy says, or this is what our legislation says. And that when someone, if someone new comes into a hierarchical power structure, they can't just make a decision that suddenly changes things, because those policies or those laws exist.
Thank you for that. And just, I wanted to speak to what you started with, Melissa, is that inertia, right? In certain areas, certain professions we're talking about here, there's a real inertia and a real resistance to the shift and change that is a lot of energy. So I hear it also, all of the panelists over the last 3 sessions have been talking about the energy that is going towards, you know, kind of changing the structures is not energy and effort and resources that go towards doing the good work and being spread so thin. And I think the inertia within some of the institutions, some of the professionals in the institutions not wanting and resisting that change is also, and I think in one of those ways that I'm seeing, and I would agree, is that financial piece. And we talked a little bit about the granting structures needing to shift and change, and those needing to keep up and be more, you know, aligning themselves more with the national UN declaration, legislative instruments, which they are mandated to do. So thank you for that. If we're all good, I'll move on to the next question. And we also have a couple of great questions in the chat that hopefully we'll get to. So the next one here, and I think, again, we're segueing nicely through this, is how do you deal with some of the negativity or pushback against your work in the GLAM sector, working with Indigenous content? And I think, Melissa, you started to answer this one in your last comment around, right, some of people who don't want to shift and change. And so I don't know if you have any further comments yourself on this one, again, some of that pushback we get with this work. And can I be cheeky and ask you to start?
Sure.
Thank you.
I think, yeah, I've been writing down sort of responses to this. So some of the things I had for this one are just to know your resources, like what are your policies? What tools are there? Like I noticed there was a question in the chat earlier about resources, but for example, know what recommendations the Canadian Federation of Library Associations made in response to the TRC and what the archives community has done, know the protocols for Native American materials, just so you can kind of prove you're not just pulling stuff out of the air. And then personally, there are a number of things that, just because I have encountered negativity and such, personally, I think having just the formal and informal spaces and connections are really important. Like, have people you can, you know, are allies, people you know you can like safely discuss issues with. I am going to pop a link into the chat, which I will just find, yeah, why people of color need spaces without white people, because having those spaces for Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been important for me. It's a bit of a long read, so you can take a look at that later. I think mentally, being prepared for that pushback is something I've tried to do. And I don't know, I sort of go back and forth about whether or not that's helpful, because is that something that's, I mean, there's not always pushback. So I don't know if that's sort of more anxiety inducing, having to feel like I'm always prepared just in case. And then also, yeah, like I think I've just had to realize it, especially in online spaces, like not to give the same weight to every random person making some sort of negative comment about something. So that's been kind of helpful for me. And again, like I was relating back to the kind of power question, just knowing that I am at an organization that supports the work I'm doing is really important. And I just, just sharing a experience that happened and how, I was involved with this conversation in an online space where I actually felt like I had to let my manager know that if somebody emails our organization complaining about me or saying I'm not a good archivist, that just be aware that this is the context. That did not happen to me, but it did get to the point where I felt like I had to just kind of put that caution there. So yeah, having the support is just so important.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Would any of our other panelists like to add? Or Genevieve, thank you.
I haven't always been very good at it. I don't know if I am now. I don't know if I just am lucky that my team has grown into a group that is much more supportive, but I have certainly worked within organizations and with groups of people who were vocally and actively against the work that I was both assigned and on my own trying to do, in terms of everything we've talked about, in terms of Indigenous engagement, in terms of ensuring that ownership and control of material is in the hands of Indigenous communities. When I first started out in this career, it was a constant fight to justify and explain why I felt it was important. And I think what Melissa said about knowing your resources, for me, that's been so important. I feel really uncomfortable sticking up for something if I don't feel like I'm really well versed in it, if I am not able to really clearly articulate. I find that some of the bullies that I've been faced with are people who are incredibly well spoken. So even if they don't have as much experience and knowledge about a subject as I do, if they can argue it better than me, then I just shut down and I don't respond. So for me, a big part of it is, as Melissa said, memorizing the protocols for Native American materials, really knowing UNDRIP inside out. I mean, I'm terrible at remembering numbers and memorizing things, but I now have certain articles just at my fingertips. It's not the same as actual experience, but for me, that has given me the confidence to be able to, in a meeting, say, well, actually, there's these things and these are the reasons why. These are the things standing behind this decision. And on top of it, being in an organization that supports the work obviously is hugely helpful. And if I wasn't in a situation where I didn't feel like the work was supported, I think I would still be much less comfortable sticking up for it. I also agree, as Melissa said, that having people that you can talk to. So at one point I was working in a team, a fairly large team, where I really felt like I was the only person on that immediate team who was really on board with Indigenous data sovereignty, Indigenous information sovereignty, and fighting for that and working towards that. And so I definitely sought out people, including Genevieve Hill and others, who I could talk to talk about, just to talk about it in general, just broadly, and other people at other institutions in the profession. And the more I did that, the more I felt like there was a support network of people that were on the same page, the more confident I became, and eventually was able to stand up in meetings and talk about it without feeling like I was just a waste of everyone's time and space.
So coming from archaeology side of things, I have a long history of having people react negatively to the work that I do. So as a consultant, it's the developer or the person with the backhoe that's annoyed that I'm there and doesn't understand why I'm there. So I think that sort of primed me for working in the glam sector. And I wish that I could say that it wasn't as bad as that, but it is in a more polite fashion. And I think the change facing the glam sector is more achievable than perhaps the development sector. But I think for me, the way that I deal with the negativity and I deal with the pushback is twofold. One is to, as you say, know your documents. We have sort of a radical openness in our ICAR department here about, why things are the way they are. How did it get to be that way? And like really understanding the details of the colonial program that took place here. And not shying away for that, not trying to make excuses for that, but discussing it quite openly. And the second one, and this is maybe, maybe even more of a therapy side for me, is that I document a lot of this. So if there are interactions that are negative, I document that. And you never know when the stars will align and something will be initiated, and you can rely on those documents to show a pattern of negative behavior. Whether you'll get the outcome you want, I don't know. But at least, to me, it's the thought that sometime in the future that might be helpful, but also writing it down, just for me, almost like journaling. It just really helps me sort of like put the thoughts somewhere else so that I don't have to ruminate on that negativity all the time.
Thank you, Genevieve. I don't know, Jordan, do you have anything to add to, or would you comment on the pushback, negativity, how you deal with it, or any advice? Or
I just stew on it and internalize it, and then passively rant about it in public panels. And aside from that, I think, like a lot of it's been touched on. I think, like an idea of like coalition building within institutions, I think is important. And I think, strategizing with other people who are in similar positions and facing similar difficulties is one means. I think for me, like particularly working in the context of Vancouver, like I often find strength in knowing that I often have the support of my community and can express as much. I kind of think about sort of like channeling that strength and thinking about the mentors that I've had from Musqueam who have been so assertive and have made changes through standing their ground and confronting institutions, including the Museum of Anthropology, including other institutions within our traditional territory. So that, for me, that is part of how I respond. And I think while, I also agree with what Melissa said about like, I think like there is something kind of exhausting about always having to anticipate like being like thinking that you're going to have to be defensive or like bring forward evidence to support your perspective or whatever the case may be. So that is, yeah, I can definitely relate to that. But yeah, I think that's about all I have to add.
Thank you for that. Really the frankness and the thoughtfulness with which you've all answered this question. And I just want to come back to, I think, one of the questions as well, and some resources that have been shared in the chat. So just a reminder, we will be making available all of the resources shared, as well as a number of other ones that have been suggested from panelists and ones relevant to the topics on the space, where that will be put into the chat throughout the program, where the recordings lie. And I just wanted to intersect before we get to our last kind of pre-ads question, and it comes to one Kim Lawson put in, and I think it just segues nicely from this, and I don't know if there's anything to add here, but she asks, how do you get to what she's calling a critical mass to provide safety for people seeking to make institutional change? And I think it ties nicely into this, and Melissa and Jordan's comments about that emotional labor anxiety that you kind of is constantly there, because you have to anticipate and be prepared for that negative reaction. And I really appreciated, Jordan, your frankness when you opened your answer. And I think that's it. Much of it is, I don't know that we have answers, but this idea of a critical mass, this idea of, coming together in what, communities of care in professional circles. And Melissa, you shared the other article that talks about that, having spaces. So one way that I'm hearing you say is having spaces that can bring together people in a safe way that can speak to this. One that I've heard Genevieve Hill say is just, documentation and that radical openness, and really addressing it as it comes through, and building, really those cases for those bigger shifts. Would there be anything else that would kind of build to that larger, as opposed to the personal pushback that we've talked about, the negativity? Would there be any other suggestions or comments you would make that would build that critical mass space? Does that ring true for anyone?
Thinking in the long term and relating back to one of the things we discussed at a previous section is the education portion, just including Indigenous perspectives, protocols, and that understanding where we've come from as professions and why they are the way they are. It's not some neutral thing. It's, it's all linked in with colonialism and all that stuff. So long term, making sure people are entering this profession understand what that history is. I'm not so well, I guess it sort of relates to critical mass. One of the things that I have found that has helped me when I've been, whether at some sort of conference or in a job, is just having other Indigenous people there, so you're not the only one, and you don't feel the pressure to represent all Indigenous people, or the expectation, because there's some diversity there, and you don't have to bear like the entire weight, and you can kind of spread out the work, like, and like I've gone, for example, when I do go to a conference, I'll like check out the room and see who's there. And they are largely white spaces for the most part, but I've literally been in conferences where somebody's said something in the Q&A portion, and another Indigenous person has leaned over and said, do you want to take this one, or should I just, which one, spread out the work. But just seeing more of us in those spaces is great, and it normalizes that we're part of these professions as well. So there's some thoughts.
I would just have to say that there needs to be mechanisms for feedback that, like, institutions, when faced with the awareness that they aren't a safe space for Indigenous people. And when they're faced with a recognition that in order, that they need to have more Indigenous people on staff in permanent full-time positions, institutions that then make some changes, they need to have a mechanism whereby they're soliciting feedback from people and can take it in a way without getting offended constantly by it. You can't just make change, implement change, and then not ask anybody if it worked. You need to really be reflecting, like, did that work? Is that good? What else can we do? And then when you're asking them what else can we do, making sure that you're paying people for that and not just assuming that, because you're a marginalized person in this situation, that it's in your best interest to answer me and give me a good, solution to the problem. They really have to start looking at these situations and really putting financial support and other supports in behind people trying to make that positive change, because that positive change won't just happen as soon as a big institution asks for it. They need to meaningfully support getting that change and making it a safe place to even bring up those issues. So
Here, Genevieve. I agree. On the question of critical mass, I've found in my experience, if you're facing a room full of racist people who are bullying you, sometimes you only need to get one person on side to start. I found when I came into a team that was incredibly negative, I was still earlier in my career. I was really nervous. I was really quiet. And then one other person, after some time, who we started together, started to speak up as well. And when we had the two of us, we found that other people started to follow. So I think that there are always, in a group like that, the critical mass goes both ways. So sometimes I think there are always not always, but there are often truly racist and cruel people who are going to be against you. But many of the people that are agreeing with them are simply following. And you sometimes just need to get the ball started. It's so daunting to face an entire group of people that are saying those things. But if you can just start with one, that was just my experience, though. It really helped shift the mood in the room to have one person on side, and then it started to shift and shift. So that idea of critical mass, I think it can snowball, but start small, because it's too much to take on everybody all at once.
Thank you so much for letting me sneak that one in. So we're moving to our next question, but I'm going to be cheeky and pair it with one that came in the chat, because I think they're aligned in the segue is what we've just spoken about. And I think some of you have started to answer this already. It's a short one. It's basically, how do you define true allyship? But I want to put in Susan Maver's question that she shared before she had to leave. As a consultant, as a museum consultant, she asked, what do you think the role of the consultant is in pointing out this sometimes unwelcome information, for instance, on timelines or budgets or protocols to their clients? So really, what is, how do you define true allyship? And I think maybe you started down answering this question, and I don't know if anyone wants to lean into this one in particular.
Very quickly, to answer Susan's part of it, I welcome every time a consultant brings back critical feedback or comments on things like that, because so often the voices internally are not heard and not heard and not heard for all of those power structure reasons that we talked about before. And having outside voices support that. Sometimes they're more forceful because they have a shorter period of time. They don't have the same time to have long discussions about it. It's really important. That can be incredibly helpful for an institution to have outside people come in and say, look, it's not good enough. We need to change this.
Would anyone want to address the defining true allyship piece here? Or taking a crack at a definition?
Yeah. I don't know if I have a definition per se, but more kind of elements of it. But it's related to stuff that's already being brought up, but listening and being willing to actually hear and respond to that, to criticisms without getting defensive is really important. And visible support for your Indigenous colleagues is really important. Like one thing that I've seen happen in all sorts of spaces that somebody will raise something, and then afterwards people will come up to them and say, I'm really glad you brought that up, but they will not say it in the meeting itself, which is when you really need the support, because that you kind of assume everybody who's not speaking up is against it or what have you. So you need, especially if you're in a situation where someone is being bullying, for example. So yeah, making sure that if you agree, you say you agree publicly, and that if you're, what can happen too is it's an idea that something Indigenous people brought up, but they're not the ones credited for it. So if saying things like this was so-and-so's idea, if you're in that kind of situation. I think sometimes when we're talking about this work, we're talking for institutions, talking about bringing people into the room rather than actually going out to people. So we've talked about relationships through all three sessions. So that's so important, like when developing those relationships, even when there's no project. And just another danger is assuming you're the expert because you have the degrees or what have you. So recognizing the other types of expertise. And thank you for the link, Kim, in the chat. Thanks.
Thanks, Melissa. Genevieve Hill. Jordan, did you have anything you wanted to add? I like how you said that elements of allyship that you would suggest.
Melissa said everything I was going to say.
Excellent. Well, not excellent that she, well, you know what I'm saying. So we're on the same page. It's grand. So, and I think that was something you said, and I just want to echo it because I think it's so important, Melissa, is that I was in something the other day where something happened and someone, after said a public, kind of incident or public, like you said, kind of it happens at the time and then people take you aside and say something later, calls for a public response. And I just thought that's so true. And it's at the institutional level, I think, but also at that individual level, right? Really that idea that we need to really think about how we address these things and to kind of pull someone aside and say, oh no, I'm your ally on the down low is not going to cut it anymore. Like you really need to use your whatever agency you might have in any context to do that. And it kind of comes back to, I love that term now, radical openness. I'm going to steal Genevieve. Genevieve Hill, did you want to add?
Yeah, just quickly, I just wanted to, with regard to Melissa's comment about people being allies after the fact and not in that important moment, I think there's a role that has been played by institutional structure. And so, how sometimes Indigenous subject matter is isolated in certain departments and there's not a lot of cross-departmental meetings or opportunities to provide that support. And so I guess institutions just need to really reflect on how their structure is influencing the ability of staff members to support one another in making these big changes. It's all really hard during COVID, of course, when everybody's, really, really isolated, but back in normal times, it still is isolating if departments are sort of segregated that way. So
Thank you. And I think that also I want to share, if everyone's not following the chat, our colleague Kim Lawson, has a couple of, sage pieces of advice here. Speak up even when you feel scared, and really to transfer the benefits of your privilege to those who have less. And I think from what we're hearing, there's many ways to do that, right? There's many ways institutionally, and we're forging new ways all the time around allyship. So I wanted to go to make sure that we address the questions that have been asked as well. And I think we've covered a number of them. But one question our colleague Amber had put into the chat, and Jordan, you started to answer this already in the chat, was if I could go around the room and ask you all to speak to maybe one or two. You've mentioned a number of resources that we've surfaced, the Native American protocols, the CCA's response to the TRC 69 and 70, CFLA's great work in doing this, as well as a handful of other articles. But are there any other resources that you would suggest or share or put out there for non-Indigenous staff and colleagues specifically, is what Amber was asking, to do this work? And Kim Lawson has shared another article here on allyship, or sorry, a Twitter feed, a Twitter thread. Could I be cheeky? Can I start with you, Genevieve Hill? I know we just finished with you, but can I start with you just to prompt it? Or if there's anyone else who wants to jump up, if I put you on the spot, please jump in.
I'm afraid I can't think of anything off the top of my head to share.
All right, that's why I hate doing that. I'm just going to say, thanks, apologies. Sorry, Genevieve Weber, it looks like you unmuted, thanks.
Yeah, it's hard to think of things on the spot, but I guess a couple things come to mind. One is the reconciliation framework for Canada's archives, which was the recently completed document that is in some ways similar to the protocols for Native American archival materials, but with a very Canadian focus on it. There's so many articles that I would love to share that I'm just not thinking of at the moment, but I think what I've said in past webinars and would like to reiterate is building groups of networking with other archivists that do similar work, and whether that's reaching out on your own, which can seem daunting, but I encourage everyone to do it, because I think the vast majority of people in the field will respond, especially if they're have done this kind of work and know the toll that it can take. But also there are some groups that are already established, and one that I am thinking of is the trauma-informed practice group that they meet regularly and they do sort of webinars and talks, but it's a really good group, particularly for folks in the field working with records of trauma or encountering, engaging with researchers that are researching records of trauma. So that can be a really good support network and a good place to start as well. It's not necessarily specifically about allyship, but it's a good place to meet others who are working in the field and working specifically with difficult and traumatic records.
I'm unmuting just to say I can't think of anything off the top of my head that hasn't already been mentioned, but I'm glad that question has been asked, because often, well, not often, sometimes you have somebody come to you and just say, here's the situation, what's the answer? And there's all sorts, there are resources. This is not the first time people have been talking about these issues, or go look at what people have already said and the work that's already been done as a start.
Yeah, I think we have, like, throughout the 3 sessions, we've talked about these things a lot. I think, two very general but applicable resources would be the TRC calls to action and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I think, like, to familiarize yourself with those 2 documents would be a useful thing to do. And I think other resources are probably context specific, like, if you were wanting to work with a community or about to work with a community, or, I think it's being mindful of whose land you occupy and knowing that history better and doing what you can to learn that, like, so that you're not, like expecting an education from the people that you're working with when there's potentially and likely already resources accessible to help fill those gaps. So that's what I would suggest as a very general answer to that question.
Thank you all for that. Those are fantastic. And I think, yeah, we've mentioned a number of these throughout the 3 separate webinars. And just to reiterate, we will post all of these and continually to add to them and keep the conversation going where the recordings are sitting and they've been put into the chat as well, a number of resources. And I think one, oh, sorry, Jordan. Yes.
I just remembered, and even like there was like a task force report from the 90s, the Royal Commission, Turning the Page, I think it's called, like, even just, because it's kind of depressing and mind-boggling how pertinent that document still feels, 30 years later. Sorry, that just came to my mind.
No, I knew that was going to come back to haunt me. Yes, I agree. And I think that's it. We're there, these, and I think this was mentioned earlier, these have been surfaced before. And, sometimes we have to come all the way full circle to these legislative instruments that are really saying, a number of things that have been said. And to me, a number of things that stand out in these are about respect and reciprocity and bringing resources to the table, respecting and knowing the land you're on, doing that work, not expecting others to do it for you, coming prepared and with humility, I think encouraged to do this work is a lot of the themes that have been surfaced throughout the webinars. So I just have so much gratitude for the amazing folks who've joined us for these last 3 panels, everyone here in doing this work. So thank you all. Thank you everyone who's joined us. We're being recorded and will be available on the Dialogue Center site as well as the Learning Circles YouTube channel. And if you've missed parts 1 and 2, and part 3 will also be there. For those who can, please join us for the upcoming event, Decolonizing Wellness, Indigenous Women's Perspectives on Healthcare, taking place on November 30th from 9 to 1. So this is a virtual event that brings together 16 Indigenous women leaders to discuss ways we can work together to create supportive healthcare systems, address inequity, and support women's wellness. So again, so much gratitude to all of our panelists for coming and really being honest and engaged and thoughtful and bringing so much amazing work and experience to the table. And everyone in our chat, Kim Lawson, Susan, Amber today, and many others before for sharing this. And Kristen, thank you for bringing us together in this way. Truly grateful again. And thank you for bringing me into this conversation. I truly feel honored. So again, take good care, everyone, and hopefully our paths will cross sooner rather than later.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.